Hi everyone, this is Unlock Ukraine, and today we host Amanda Paul, the expert of European Policy Center. Welcome, Amanda.
Good morning, Marta. Thanks for the invitation.
Of course, Amanda, we talked a few years ago. There was an interview that I took with you for another journal, and I'm very pleased that it's a second time you agreed to do the interview, this time for the video. My question would be, the questions altogether would be around your expertise. So could you share with our audience what your expertise is? What do you do in the European Policy Center?
In the EPC, I work as a senior analyst in the Europe in the World programme, and I lead our work on the eastern flank. So Ukraine, Moldova, the South Caucasus, Black Sea security, as well as everything to do with Turkey.
We will come back to Turkey. Turkey is a very important country to talk about, and I think it is your first area of expertise. Let's talk about Ukraine first. When is the first time that you encountered Ukrainian issue? When did the file on Ukraine arrived to your table?
If I remember correctly, it was during the Orange Revolution. So that was, a long time ago. And Ukraine was obviously a different country in those days. But the Orange Revolution started a process that has continued actually up until today. From my perspective, it was when, civil society really became an important actor in Ukraine. It was when people woke up and wanted change. They wanted to get rid of, corruption, no rule of law, politicians that were controlled by the Kremlin, and to reject Russian influence in their country. That was the beginning of the process. So it was a great time to start working on Ukraine.
You remember the Orange Revolution, right? And do you remember the intention of Ukrainian nation? Did they want to become a member of European Union? How was it perceived in the EU, this revolution and the European path of Ukraine?
I think the Orange Revolution was sort of a starting point for Ukrainians to want to be more engaged and to be a bigger part of Europe, and to have the goal perhaps one day of becoming a member. But I wouldn't say it was the main sort of driving force. I think this came, later on, around the Euromaidan revolution, and before that the association agreement, etc., etc. But it was certainly a starting point when Ukrainians also became, I would say, more aware of their own identity, more aware of the fact that they no longer wanted to be under the influence of Russia. I guess we all remember the famous visit of President Putin during that time to actually campaign on behalf of, Viktor Yanukovych, which, looking back now, it seems like impossible that could have happened. But it did happen. He was basically the candidate of Putin. So Ukrainians snapped, I would say, at that point, and said, no, we don't accept this anymore. This is our country. We're not part of Russia. We're an independent Ukrainian state, and we want Yushchenko, the guy who'd been, originally elected, pro-European guy, who we know was poisoned and whatnot. So it was a battle, but Ukrainians succeeded there. They got what they wanted.
But after a few years, they lost it.
Yes, that's an interesting point. Then they re-elected, Yanukovych, and we all know what happened, after that. One can only imagine the thinking of why they decided to elect Yanukovych again, but we know the problems that existed between Yushchenko and Yulia Tymoshenko during that reign of not being able to do anything, no progress, no reforms, etc. Both of them were too self-interested rather than being interested in the future of the country and its Euro-Atlantic integration.
But now when we look back, this re-election happened after the invasion of Russia in Georgia. Did Ukrainians not pay attention? Did Europe not pay attention?
Europe certainly didn't pay attention. The invasion of Georgia, if we remember, was, rewarded with a reset button by the US administration. President Obama went to meet with President Putin and gave him that button, which had a badly spelt word in Russian on it, actually. So they decided that the reward for invading Georgia was a reset of relations, that Russia could be, forgiven for that mistake. Never mind the fact that they were occupying like nearly 20% of Georgian territory, and by the way continue to do that today, and even extend their occupation almost every month by moving their sort of boundaries. So I don't think it was at all understood then. There was still this perception that the West shouldn't aggravate the Russians, we shouldn't escalate things with the Russians, that we need to have a dialogue and a constructive relationship with the Russians because they're important, which seemed to be a mistake. Maybe even in Ukraine, at that point, there was a different sort of understanding over the Russian leadership, or maybe Georgia was just seen as being far away, not relevant to them. But in retrospect, it was a mistake, the response of the West then, and if they'd had a different response, perhaps Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine or even the annexation of Crimea back in 2014 wouldn't have happened.
Ukraine is now almost 1 year a candidate member of the EU. Do you think that Ukraine has the chance to become the EU member before the 2029?
I think Ukraine has a chance to become a member of the EU. I think it would be very difficult to do it in that time frame. I mean, there's no country that's had a really speedy accession to the EU. But if there's a determination inside Ukraine to carry out the necessary reforms, which is obviously extremely difficult because of the ongoing war, I do think the process can go quite well, subject to the accession talks actually starting. And that needs to be the first goal. I mean, Ukraine needs to fully comply with the conditions, the seven steps that were asked by the Commission in order to open accession. That's not always straightforward because the conditions are not set out in stone. I mean, they're quite vague in how they can be interpreted.
And where is Ukraine, where could Ukraine do better today to accelerate the process? Is there something that Ukraine is doing really wrong?
I mean, they're not doing anything wrong, which is a good thing. And they've actually met quite a lot of the steps already, or are well on the way. I mean, me and my colleague Svetlana at the EPC just recently made an analysis on this. But the key issues are related to the reform of the judiciary, this whole issue around constitutional court reform, this special commission that was set up to review candidates, finalizing the steps on this so that there will be a transparent process for vetting candidates and then not being able to block certain candidates, and also the law on de-oligarchization. I mean, these are crucial issues for Ukraine to really make progress on and properly. And they're historical problems in Ukraine, let's be frank. I mean, oligarchs have been a problem in Ukraine since the beginning of time, if I can put it that way. Yeah, I mean, it's already changed significantly. We know that. I mean, it changed before the war. I mean, steps were taken by President Zelensky to already reduce the role of oligarchs. But I mean, it still hasn't been 100% done. I mean, this is not something that can just be done overnight, because oligarchs and, let's say, very rich business people have their fingers in a lot of different pots and have always had a lot of influence over Ukraine's governance institutions. So it's a process that needs to be done properly and finally end the role of oligarchs in the country. And this is something that the EU sees as crucial.
Ukraine is now a candidate member to the EU, but also Ukraine wants to become a member of NATO. Now NATO raised Finnish flag. Let's say because of the Russian invasion into Ukraine, how do you see the membership of Ukraine in NATO? Would that be a parallel process to the EU, or should Ukraine become member of NATO before becoming member of the EU, or after, or when the war is won? How would you assess the transatlantic integration?
Personally, I would accept Ukraine into NATO tomorrow, right? But I mean, I'm not sitting up in NATO headquarters. And to give the honest answer, I think Ukraine's NATO membership will be very difficult. I mean, we know that when President Zelensky submitted the application to join NATO, the response was silence. I mean, a dead silence. There's been no clear response from NATO as to what's going to happen next, despite the fact that in 2008 at the Bucharest summit, both Georgia and Ukraine were promised a seat at NATO's table, which in effect is already a commitment to membership. But clearly there's some countries within the NATO alliance that are not that keen on Ukraine's membership. So I don't see that the two things are going to happen in parallel.
Which countries are not happy with Ukraine to be in the NATO?
I mean, it's maybe it's undiplomatic to mention specific countries, but I think the ones that were traditionally already opposed, France, Germany, question mark over even the United States and the United Kingdom, I would say. So there needs to be a lot of work done by the Ukrainian side and by other actors in Ukraine, civil society, to promote this question. I mean, the NATO summit is coming up in July in Lithuania. I mean, Lithuanians are excellent friends of Ukraine. So I think this will be a good opportunity for NATO to maybe clarify their position vis-a-vis Ukraine. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. They'll probably say it's a long process. But I mean, this membership is certainly not for tomorrow. I think there's still concerns within the NATO, believe it or not, vis-a-vis the response of Russia. I mean, I hate saying that because it seems unbelievable that after 1 year of war, the West is still worrying about the response of Russia. But I mean, it's a fact that they actually are, which is crazy.
Well, you said many things that actually opened my eyes, especially like the US being a question mark. But the work of civil society, you said that civil society could do more, could do better to prepare Ukraine's membership in NATO. What could Ukrainian civil society do?
I mean, it's about advocacy and lobbying in member states. I mean, they need to have, I mean, for me, it's a non-argument, right? Ukraine should be part of NATO. It has every right to be part of NATO. It's part of the, it's in Northern Europe. It fits into the alliance. And at the end of the day, I personally believe that NATO membership is the only thing that can really guarantee Ukraine's security. I mean, it's difficult to come up with alternatives. I mean, we know there's an ongoing discussion about security guarantees for Ukraine that's actually been going on since the first days of this war. But so far, there's no clarification about what this could actually be. I mean, bilateral security agreements, perhaps, or the sort of equivalent relationship that the United States has with Israel, which is 100% guaranteed by the US. I mean, they supply them with arms, they protect them. Or even with Japan, for example. But there's no clarification. This is 1 year in. NATO membership would be the optimal answer for Ukraine. I mean, there's no reason why they couldn't get it during the war. Obviously, they're not. But saying that we don't want to give it to Ukraine, because whatever reason they could come up with, or whatever reason they are, reflecting, behind that is Russia. This is very clear. The reason why Ukraine won't get it, and the reason why Georgia didn't get it, because just to remind, Georgia was more prepared to enter NATO than some of the Western Balkan countries that actually joined NATO, was because of Russia.
Let's imagine if Ukraine became a member of NATO now, would NATO engage the Article 5 to defend Ukraine now, or would there be some sort of freezing of this part of negotiations, of agreement not to involve all the countries of NATO against Russia?
I mean, the thing is that NATO should have accepted Ukraine, prior to the war, okay? If they'd done that, this situation may not have occurred. But I mean, the thinking was then, we don't want to proceed because we don't want to have a clash with Russia. I mean, Ukraine joining NATO now today is not going to happen, for the reason that you just mentioned, because too many people would be concerned about that issue. So that's not going to happen, and this is probably the reason why they won't accept Ukraine in the future, because there could be another incident where they would do Article 5, But again, it still boils down to Russia. It means that decisions are still being made based on the threat that emanates from the Kremlin.
So what should happen to Russia that Ukraine becomes a member of NATO? How would the complete defeat of Russia look like then?
I mean, it's a very difficult question to answer because, I mean, it's not clear what the complete defeat of Russia actually means, right? Because it's talked about in terms of, you know, Putin leaving power or the defeat of Putin or Russian troops on the battlefield in Ukraine. But at the end of that day, that doesn't necessarily mean the defeat of Russia. So it depends how you view it, because there's no guarantee that whoever would come after Putin would be any better than Putin, which is, you know, I don't see any good candidates, quite honestly. I mean, to be honest, which is already depressing. But I think whoever is going to lead Russia, at least for the medium term, for many decades into the future, is going to be an authoritarian type of person who basically views Ukraine through the same prism as Putin does. I mean, that's his vision of Ukraine, seeing Ukraine as part of Russia, and all those, you know, narratives that he has isn't unique to him. I mean, it's a narrative that's shared. This imperialistic policy is shared by a large number of the Russian population. So I think this is something that would continue into the future. It's more important at this point that the West, including the EU, actually start to think about what sort of policy they should have with Russia, or how they're going to deal with Russia following Ukraine's victory, because it's not going to be straightforward.
So Ukraine's victory doesn't necessarily mean the full defeat of Russia.
I mean, I don't think it means that at all, because, you know, the Russians, who are already still commiserating themselves about the collapse of the Soviet Union, I mean, they seem to be in a permanent depression. I mean, Putin still grieves the loss of the Soviet Union, you know, decades after. To be defeated in Ukraine, to be the loser again, will reinforce this sense of, you know, of grief, if I can put it that way. And the Russians will need to find a way to deal with that as a country, as a society, and that's not going to be straightforward, because they'll continue to view the reason why they lost this war as a direct result of the West, you know, invading them, or that narrative that they continue to spread, which is lies. But I mean, we know that when you look in the Russian media, this is all about the US or the West's efforts to, or second effort to disintegrate Russia. Because I mean, Putin always says, back in the day, the West wanted the complete disintegration of our country. They were happy that the Soviet Union collapsed, but they wanted what was left of Russia to also break up into all these, you know, tiny little statelets. So this is the second attempt to do that. This is their narrative.
Wouldn't be for real, you know, if there is a full disintegration of Russian Federation, then there would be no threat for Ukraine, Georgia, and other countries in future. Wouldn't that be considered as full defeat of Russia?
I mean, you can see it like that, but I mean, that sort of disintegration would have a huge amount of blowback and turmoil throughout the whole neighborhood of Russia's borders. To be honest, Europe just wants the war to be over. I mean, that's the truth. I think that they're very worried about the possible scenario where Russia would disintegrate, because it's a huge country and it would have ramifications that go far beyond, you know, the borders of Russia. I mean, uprising, conflicts within Russia from all these statelets. You know, we know how many there are. I mean, there's tens of them. I mean, Chechnya, Dagestan, you know, Tatarstan, all these small countries possibly, you know, breaking up, and Russia would be left as a really tiny little country, right? So I'm not sure this is a really popular concept throughout the West.
Europe wants the war to be over, to finish. When do you think the war finish in time frame, but also condition-wise?
I mean, Europe wants the war to be over, but it needs to end on with Ukraine in a strong position and a Ukrainian victory. This is clear. I mean, personally, I don't expect the war to end before the end of 2024, which is already a long time, simply because in 2024 there's a lot of crucial elections, ending with the US presidential elections. I mean, another 1.5 years of fighting is hard to swallow. I understand that. And I'm guessing from a Ukrainian perspective, to say that it's tiring for the country, the population, the military, is an understatement. But I think there's probably a clear understanding as well that the year 2024 will be a crucial turning point, one way or another. I mean, for the Russians, they can fight forever.
They have a lot of people.
I mean, let me put it this way. For Russia, 1 year is a short time in terms of wars that they've fought, because they have no value of human life. I mean, it's just a machine, isn't it? They just send people, they get people, they bring them, they put them on the front line. It's just cannon fodder. And it's correct that the Russians are losing. I mean, I think that's my opinion anyway, that they are losing. They haven't been able to meet their objectives. I mean, this latest offensive more or less failed. They were unable to gain any sort of meaningful bits of territory, maybe a few meters here or there, but that wasn't the objectives. But that doesn't mean that the Russians will, put up the white flag and say, okay, we're done, because that's not going to happen. And also this war's become like very personalized for President Putin. I mean, he obviously hates Zelensky, and vice versa, in the same way that he hated Mikhail Saakashvili. So it's become very personal. But as I said, I think the Russians are ready to fight on and on, which makes it really more important that the West speeds up their delivery of arms and the types of arms that they are sending to Ukraine, because Ukraine still hasn't been able to launch its new counter-offensive due to not having sufficient arms deliveries from the West.
Ukraine still has not got the...
It's too slow.
Would you criticize the West?
I always criticize the West. I mean, listen, Ukraine should have had the necessary military equipment to defend itself even before the war. I mean, this was a major mistake in the calculation, but again, this comes back to the same point. Oh, we don't want to escalate with the Russians. But if Ukraine had had the necessary weapons on the ground prior to the war, the situation could have been different. But I mean, every time it takes so long to get from what they need to the actual delivery of it. And now there's the issue over ammunition. So the EU and the US industrial base, as we know, have had to speed up production of munitions, which is also a time-consuming process.
You're evaluating this situation from today's point of view. Did you also have this position a year ago? Did you believe that Putin would invade Ukraine and Ukraine has to be better equipped?
I mean, I believe that Russia was capable of invading Ukraine, yes, because at the end of the day, this war didn't start last year. It started in 2014, but this wasn't seen back in 2014. I mean, it wasn't seen by the West as a significant security threat to Europe. If Russia had only invaded eastern Ukraine, which is what most people predicted, I mean, last year, probably the response from the West would have been much softer. I mean, not giving the sort of military equipment that's been delivered, and a question mark over the sort of sanctions that would have been applied. There would have been less unity, but because it was a full-scale invasion, they actually had to do something. But I do believe that after Russia annexed Crimea, there should have been a much more robust response. I mean, myself and many other analysts and individuals, particularly from the Baltic states, Poland and whatnot, strongly recommended this at the time, and then the years that went afterwards. But that isn't what happened, which is why Russia continued to strengthen its position in the Black Sea, on Crimea. Then there was a whole incident around the Sea of Azov. The response to that was like nothing as well. So we ended up where we did, with Russia feeling that it could do what it wanted. I doubt that the Russians expected, well, they certainly didn't expect the Ukrainian, the strength of the Ukrainian response, but I don't think they expected either the strength of the response from the West. But because the war in Ukraine directly impacts European security, and there could have been a major spillover effect into EU member states, this played a key role in this, the sort of strong response that came from the EU and others.
What about the role of Turkey in the war between Russia and Ukraine and sanctions? Turkey is the country where sanctions could be evaded by different companies. How would Turkey be placed in this geopolitical circumstances?
I mean, Turkey's, placed itself in the middle of the road. I mean, it has a foot in either camp. I mean, Turkey didn't join the EU and US sanctions, but Turkey never joins any sort of sanctions unless they're UN sanctions, so perhaps that wasn't surprising. But at the same time, Turkey has continued, as we know, to have good relations with Russia, and particularly the relationship between President Erdogan and President Putin, which is, I would say, a very strong relationship. They both have a good understanding of each other because they've worked together in other theatres, I mean in Syria, in the South Caucasus and whatnot. So for Turkey, there was no question of alienating Russia. I mean, Russia is an important partner for Turkey, if I can put it that way.
But Turkey helps Ukraine also with Bayraktars, with this grain deal and other things.
Yeah, I was just going to come to this. On the other hand, I mean, for Turkey, regional security is important in the Black Sea and whatnot. Ukraine is also a long-term partner of Turkey. I mean, Turkey actually supports Ukraine's membership in NATO and has done for many years, and they've had a good cooperation in many sectors, not just in the economic cooperation, but in security and defense and these sorts of areas. And Turkey has been able to play, a unique role because of its relationship with the Russians and Ukraine since the beginning of the war. I mean, Turkey obviously supplied drones and other equipment to Ukraine, which was originally, criticized by the West, but turned out to be very useful. But also the grain deal. I mean, Turkey played a key role here, along with the United Nations, in mediating between the two to be able to get the grain deal up and running and to keep it running.
What will happen after elections, after May elections in Turkey?
I mean, after the elections in Turkey, I mean, if President Erdogan is re-elected, he'll continue to pursue the same policy, at least when it comes to Ukraine, to keep one foot in either camp. If the opposition get into power, I mean, they have a different foreign policy goal because they want to normalize relations with the West. I mean, under Erdogan, relations with the United States and the EU have become extremely difficult, partially due to democratic backtracking in Turkey, violations of human rights and whatnot, but also because of Turkey's frozen EU accession process, which built up a lot of resentment in Ankara and throughout the population. So if the opposition get in, we'll see a more Western approach, a stronger focus on normalizing with the West, but at the same time continuing to have good relations with Russia, but not to the same degree as the current state of affairs. I mean, President Erdogan has allowed, sanctioned good and trade to go via Turkey to Russia. Turkey has actually benefited in terms of getting, cheap energy from Russia. And if you look at the sort of, import-export statistics have significantly improved, which has been very helpful to the Turkish economy, because prior to the war, the Turkish economy was in a very bad state of affairs. I mean, it's still in dire straits, but it's improved a bit as a consequence of the war, which is, I mean, it doesn't reflect very well that Turkey has played this role, unfortunately, but that will end with the entry into power of the opposition, because they won't play those games.
What are the chances for opposition to enter power?
The chances of the opposition have significantly increased following the tragic earthquake in Turkey on the 6th of February, as I'm sure everybody saw in the news. 11 of Turkish regions were devastated. Over 50,000 people have been killed. I mean, buildings just pancaked. I mean, they just collapsed. And this is a consequence of, you know, builders not following the regulations and the government basically allowing them to do so by, you know, just giving them fines and stuff. So it was a massive violation of, you know, rules and regulations regarding construction. And this area where the earthquake happened is a significant base for the President Erdogan and the ruling Justice and Development Party, the AKP. I mean, it's a base that he's always been able to rely on to vote for him. So probably now after the earthquake, the voting pattern for that region is likely to change to some extent. I'm not going to say that every single person that was affected by the earthquake won't vote for the AKP or Erdogan, because that's unlikely to happen. But I think there's a great deal, you know, of anger and resentment and even hatred now towards Erdogan, who people hold personally responsible for the tragic loss of life, of their homes. I mean, you now have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands displaced people in Turkey. It's not even clear where a lot of these people are going to vote, so that's another issue. But this will definitely be represented in the ballot boxes in favour of the opposition alliance and the opposition presidential candidate Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. If they are able to make the most of this, as well as run a dynamic campaign, because Erdogan is an extremely good campaigner, he's a political animal. He'll stop at nothing to win this election. Also, it's not a fair playing field, which doesn't help. The media is more or less completely controlled by the ruling party, and social media and whatnot has become very difficult in Turkey. Much of it's been closed down. Probably more will be closed down, or sort of, you know, adjusted before the election. So it's going to be an uphill battle. So it's too close to call.
You're a columnist, or you were a columnist in Turkish newspapers. Do you still write?
I don't write now for any Turkish newspaper, but I mean, I still write on Turkey.
Will you travel to Turkey for elections? Will you be elections observer?
Well, Turkey doesn't actually have international election observers. They don't have really international observers. What they do have is civil society in Turkey. Observing, and civil society in Turkey is quite robust and strong. And also they've had for many years, you know, the sort of young people from the opposition Republican People's Party, which is the CHP, also watching the ballot boxing. But this year there could be potentially more a risk of election fraud. I mean, Turkey, despite the fact that President Erdogan is sort of on an authoritarian trend, if I can put it that way, has always had more or less free and fair elections for many years. Hopefully this year will be the same. You have the presidential election, and then you have parliamentary elections, because Turkey is now a presidential system. This happened a few years ago. So the presidential post basically president controls almost everything. So this is the main event, but still the parliamentary elections do have some importance, because to pass some legislation, even if it's been, you know, green lighted by the president, you need to have a majority in the parliament.
You are in contact with the Turkish civil society. Do you get some first-hand information from them for your analysis?
Turkish civil society is large and at every level, you know, from a bit like in Ukraine. It goes down to a very grassroots, local level, regional level, at national level. And again, amazingly strong people who often put their lives at risk even to do their work.
And how do they see the moves of Erdogan, the moves about blocking Finland and Sweden from membership to NATO? How does civil society perceive these things? The Cyprus issue?
I think that, when it comes to the Cyprus issue, it's a long story, but from a Turkish perspective, when Turkey was in the process of becoming an accession country, it already had candidate country, but to open accession talks, Turkey was told, you need to change your policy towards Cyprus, you need to do reforms and change. And actually, Erdogan, who was then, he was then Prime Minister actually, they did change, the ruling party changed the policy of Turkey towards Cyprus. They accepted the bizonal, bicommunal solution negotiated by the UN, which had been on the table for like many years, and they'd been part of that process, but Turkey had a more hardline position. But Turkey's position on Cyprus completely revolutionized. And if you remember, there was a famous 2004 Annan plan that went to referendum in the south and the north of the island. The north of the island is where the Turkish Cypriots live, and in the south it's where the Greek Cypriots live. And since 1974, there has been like this UN green line dividing the island. Now, shortly after Turkey started accession talks, or even before, maybe it was, I can't remember, it was a long time ago, the sort of barrier was lifted so that Greek and Turkish Cypriots could go to the other sides of the island. Because in a historical context, the Greek Cypriots traditionally lived in the north and the Turkish Cypriots more in the south. But after the wars that happened in the island, there was basically a population transfer. It's a very complicated story. But anyway, this was the first opportunity they'd had to mingle. But the 2004 referendum resulted in Turkish Cypriots saying yes, Turkey saying yes, Greece saying yes, and then the Greek Cypriots saying no. The Greek Cypriot leader then, a guy called Tassos Papadopoulos, actually went on television and asked Greek Cypriots to vote no in the referendum on the Annan plan. And this is the Annan plan that he himself actually negotiated. So that was the first disaster. Then some years on, they had the Crans-Montana format, which was the end of another UN process, which could have led to a solution of the island. The same sort of scenario. The Greek Cypriots more or less refused to be flexible enough to actually find an end to the negotiations so that Cyprus could be reunified. And it was after that that Turkey shifted back to this two-state solution. And what's important here was that after the Annan plan back in 2004, Cyprus became a member of the EU as a full member. The EU never made it a condition that Cyprus needed to be reunified to join the EU. And in retrospect, this was probably the worst foreign policy decision ever made in the history of the EU, because basically when Cyprus became a member, then they had a seat at the table and they were able to block whatever they wanted to vis-a-vis Turkey. And this made it far more difficult, not only to find a solution to the Cyprus problem, because as an EU member, they thought they could, sort of reinforce their maximalistic goals, but at the same time stall Turkey's process. So again, this time Turkey will be asked to change its policy again, which I find quite strange, right? Because 20 years ago they were asked to change their policy and they did, and now they're being asked to change it again, even though the problem that existed back then was the Greek Cypriots, and it's still the Greek Cypriots. It's actually the Greek Cypriots that also need to be asked to change their policy. It takes two to tango, right? So you need to have a Cypriot change of policy as well as a Turkish change, a second change, if you're going to actually resolve the decades-old Cyprus problem. And I'm sorry, that was a very complicated explanation, but it's that topic's for an entire discussion by itself. But when it comes to the accession of Finland and Sweden, I think there's a tendency in Europe and elsewhere to just look at this as Turkey behaving badly and being difficult. But if you look at it from a Turkish perspective, and the perspective of the average Turkish person, it's seen rather differently. I mean, there's a significant amount of support in Turkey for the position of the government, particularly vis-à-vis Sweden. The issue was never about Finland. Turkey doesn't have a problem with Finland. It never had a problem with Finland. It's always been more to do with Sweden, and that historically Sweden has allowed the representatives of the PKK, which is a terrorist organization, which is recognized as a terrorist organization by the EU and the United States, to have asylum in Sweden. And that has been a problem between Turkey and Sweden for a long time. But President Erdogan has, of course, used that issue as sort of leverage, as a way to gain domestic support in terms of the upcoming election campaign. But as we know, there was an agreement reached between Sweden and Turkey at last year's NATO summit that Sweden would meet a number of criteria in terms of extraditing people who are wanted terrorists by Turkey, making some changes to their terrorism law, among other things. And once that happened, Turkey would ratify Sweden's accession to NATO. As far as I'm aware, many of those steps have actually been taken by Sweden, but Turkey is still pushing for more. But again, this is more to do with domestic Turkish politics than it is to do with Turkey's position vis-à-vis NATO enlargement. Because traditionally Turkey has always been a strong supporter of NATO enlargement and has been an important ally in NATO and still is. But hopefully once the election's over and done with, Sweden's accession will be green-lighted, even if President Erdogan remains in power, but it certainly won't be done beforehand. So they're leveraging this for domestic purposes, but also to get something from the United States.
Amanda, we talked about Turkey as a player between Ukraine and Russia, or in the war, as one of the key players that helps, or that is a sort of a neutral platform between Russia and Ukraine. There are also Ukrainian soldiers who were in Azov still, and who were prisoners of war by Russia. They are now hosted by Turkey. So Turkey is trying to show itself as a neutral player. But what about Turkey in the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan? Is there a role that Turkey plays? Is it supporter of which position, and how is it here perceived by the West?
I mean, Turkey is not neutral in the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. I mean, Turkey has a security alliance with Azerbaijan. I mean, they view each other as brothers, and Turkey has a long-term strategic alliance with Azerbaijan. I mean, everybody knows that Turkey provided Azerbaijan with drones and other weapons, which it used effectively in the 2020 war in Nagorno-Karabakh, and allowed Azerbaijan to liberate most of the territory that Armenia had been occupying since the early 1990s. But at the same time, I mean, Turkey is engaged in a process of normalization with Armenia, which has started, I think, well over a year ago, or maybe 2 years ago, and it continues to proceed. I mean, slowly. But I mean, what's important for this region, I mean, the entire region, is that Armenia and Azerbaijan reach a final peace agreement as soon as possible, because this will bring finally security, stability, and much more economic prosperity to the South Caucasus. But it's not straightforward. There's a lot of animosity still between the two, and then you also have, of course, the Kremlin continuing to, interfere, because for Russia, it's always had a strong influence in the South Caucasus. It's always viewed the South Caucasus as its unique sphere of influence. You know, it's a back garden where nobody else has the right to go. So this new geopolitical situation where you have a bigger Turkish footprint and also a bigger EU footprint now is not pleasing to the Kremlin. So despite the fact that Russia is, you know, predominantly busy with its war in Ukraine, that hasn't stopped it from looking after its interests in the South Caucasus.
But Russia does not show it shows its support for Armenia, but it's not very expressive in this support.
I mean, Russia is a lousy ally of Armenia. You know, Armenia is part of the CSTO. They also have a special, you know, security and military alliance. Russia has 2 military bases in Armenia. For many years, it was, you know, Russian agents on the border with Turkey, and also when you would arrive in Armenia, you know, probably it was Russians that would be checking your passport. But the problem is that whenever Armenia has had its security threatened, including in the 2020 war, and they asked the Russians to come and help them, you know, as is you know, written in this treaty they have, the CSTO, the Russians didn't do it. So actually, you know, Russia is a useless security ally to Armenia, and it always has been. I mean, the only thing that interests Russia is maintaining a predominant influence over the country. It's not just in the security sector, it's also in the economic sector. I mean, Russia has dominated the economy of Armenia for a long time.
If Erdogan gets re-elected, is there a chance that he will reinforce the autocratic regimes of Russia, Iran, China, Saudi Arabia? Would he join that club?
No. I mean, he's not going to join that club. I mean, Turkey doesn't join really any club, and I'm not sure they would want Turkey anyway, because Turkey is a member of NATO. As a member of NATO, Turkey is, and it's good that Turkey is a member of NATO, because this is what anchors Turkey to the West, okay? And NATO gives a platform where Turkey is engaged with its Western partners, and that's the only platform. I mean, Erdogan is going to continue to play the role of acting between the two. But I mean, the thing with Turkey now is that Turkey is an increasingly important middle power, if I can put it that way. And this comes against the backdrop of this global upheaval, if I can put it that way. I mean, we're moving to a more fragmented world. I mean, the liberal international order that we all knew for our whole lives has gone. I mean, that's gone. We're moving away from a one country rules system with no more, you know, hegemony of the United States. You know, this is gone forever. We're moving to a sort of multipolar world because of the rise of China, which and other things that have happened over the last years. That means that for a country like Turkey, it will become more geopolitically important. Not only Turkey, but some other countries. But Turkey is in a unique position simply because of its geographical position. I mean, it's at the sort of frontier between, you know, the West and the East. It's you know, there on the Middle East, you know, Central Asia. So Turkey will become a much more important interlocutor for many different issues, and Turkey will use this to its own benefit. I mean, President Erdogan has already started to do this. I mean, for a person like myself who's been, you know, working and living in Turkey for like 2 decades, it's actually amazing to see the evolution of Turkish foreign policy. I mean, Turkey used to follow EU foreign policy. It was almost aligned, I think, 80% at some point. That's really incredible to believe that now. Today it's about 7%. It's about 7 maximum, because Turkey has, you know, learned about an autonomous foreign policy. It's moved towards a more strategic autonomy, and it's sort of come to the conclusion, particularly because its relations with the West have deteriorated. I mean, this was a mistake of the EU, the fact that they allowed the relationship to become so problematic. They allowed Turkey to become sort of not isolated from the EU, but distant by by blocking the accession process, by creating, you know, many obstacles and barriers to closer integration. So Turkey has looked in other ways. So Turkey now has an extremely influential position vis-a-vis its neighborhood. I mean, the South Caucasus, Central Asia, but also in Syria and that part of the world. Turkey is now very present in large parts of Africa, which was never the case before, also in the Far East. So they've become not just a major regional player, but a global player, and a global actor that's able to sit down with Western partners via NATO and other sort of institutions, but is also able to sit with, you know, what we would call the authoritarians, not all of them authoritarians, but, you know, other actors around the world, and be seen as a serious actor. And this puts Turkey in a very unique position. And if Erdogan is re-elected, this will probably significantly grow this tendency. Turkey will become a bigger fish in a lot of different ponds around the world. But because of this fragmentation of the international order, at least from my perspective, it's important that the West doubles down on the relationship with Turkey, because whether they like Erdogan or they don't like Erdogan, because Turkey's become more of an influential actor, Turkey is a crucial interlocutor on many issues and many problems around the world, but particularly in the direct neighborhood, if it's in the Western Balkans, if it's in Syria, if it's in Africa. And I think this issue of the grain deal is just one example of that, because I'm sure many people in the EU feel very annoyed that it's Erdogan that was able to do that, but he was able to do that, and he was able to do that because of Turkey's more autonomous foreign policy, more independent foreign policy, which is obviously good for him. But I think one of the reasons also behind this was because Turkey was put in a position where the Americans and other partners in the West started to say no. For example, Turkey needs to upgrade its F-16s. They need new ones, or they need the ones they've got upgraded. And because of the fact that Turkey bought this S-400 defense system from the Russians, as you remember, this was highly controversial, even though it's still in the box that it's never been used. They were told by Washington, we're not going to give you the F-16s, you need to give back the system to the Russians, or something along these lines. So Turkey has reflected on this more problematic situation and decided to make itself less independent on its traditional Western allies, which I see that as sort of bad news. I mean, for Turkey, you could see that as a positive step, but they've decided to become less reliant on their allies. They don't feel that they can rely on them anymore. That's partially, obviously, it's a response of Turkish foreign policy. And this is also why we've seen Turkey now significantly focus on strengthening its defense sector and its industrial base to be able to create its own weapons and systems and whatnot, hence the drones, but not only.
Is Turkish independence in these terms a good news for Ukraine or a bad?
Well, I think Turkey, as I said, Turkey vis-a-vis Ukraine, it's played a positive role, although obviously it could have done better. I mean, there's many.
Even Turkey.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it must be extremely frustrating for Ukraine's leadership to see Turkey doing business as usual with the Russians, to continue to trade with Russians, not to mention how many Russians are now living in Turkey. I mean, it's extremely difficult now for normal Turks to buy apartments because there's so many Russians, you know, living in Istanbul, Antalya, Bodrum and whatnot, that the price of real estate has gone through the roof. I mean, I don't particularly enjoy rubbing shoulders with so many Russians. There's hardly a Turkish airline flight that you can get on that doesn't have a Russian. When you get on from Antalya, it's always full of Russians, and they all seem to be traveling in business class as well. So I mean, it's not a very pleasant thing. Nobody wants to live next door to Russians. I mean, they also make a lot of noise. So I would have preferred Turkey to have a much more pro-Ukrainian position, to join sanctions and whatnot in an ideal world. But I mean, even myself, as being a strong supporter of Ukraine, I can still see the fact that Turkey has been able to achieve what it's been able to achieve because it has this unique relationship with Putin. But they could do it more low-key. I mean, Putin and Erdogan laughing together, or Erdogan travelling to Moscow and always, saying we're each other's great friends and strategic partners, it's bad optics, if I can put it that way. But it's a relationship that Turkey gains from. It's a relationship that Putin gains from. I'm not even sure they really like each other, but they manage to rub shoulders and they each get something out of this relationship. And because of Turkey's relationship with Russia, Ukraine has also been able to at least have the grain deal, to have, as you said, Azov fighters returned. Turkey's played a role there, and in many other ways that probably we don't know, because a lot of what Turkey does, it does behind the scenes, and you only know about Turkish diplomacy after things have happened. I mean, I think that I don't doubt the grain deal will continue. I think that Turkey has sufficient leverage over the Russians to be able to achieve that, and even if the Russians decided to pull out, there's no reason why that grain deal can't continue without Russia.
Amanda, more probably a personal question. You are very well informed and you are reading a lot, you are moderating, you are participating in different events. When do you have time for your private life?
I think everybody has time for their private life, I mean, I tend to make, my evenings, my home life with my kids. I still have to go home and cook their dinner, even though, they're in their 20s. The first question they always ask is, what's for dinner? I still have to wash their clothes, and, do the housework, and, see my friends.
As a woman in Brussels bubble, do you feel that you had any particular challenges to overcome to become here a known, a respected person to listen to?
I mean, to be honest, I can't say that I've really encountered any challenges. I mean, maybe I've been lucky because I know that's not always the case. I mean, I think there is a need for, women to have a much stronger voice, to be more represented. I mean, first and foremost in high-ranking positions in the EU institutions, in the European Parliament, but in other organisations as well. I mean, there's still too many events where there's more men than women, and some areas are more dominated by men. I would say particularly security and defence issues. But from my own personal experience, I mean, I've never suffered any sort of issues in that respect. I mean, I've always been invited to many discussions here and elsewhere, so that's never been an issue. But I mean, in the events that I organise at the EPC, I mean, I always make a big effort to have gender balance on the event, on the panels and other sorts of discussions, and this is a policy of the EPC as well. But I feel, I mean, personally, I feel extremely lucky to have had the opportunities that I have had over the years, but also to have had the opportunity to work on Ukraine first and foremost, and the entire Eastern Partnership. But I mean, I think there's many people out there that would like to have the opportunity to work on Ukraine. It's a great country. It gives a lot, if that makes sense, in terms of your career. I mean, it's been a pleasure and a privilege to support Ukraine, to work on Ukraine, and particularly at this time, because I know that it really matters what everybody does to help Ukraine during this time, even if it's something small, and to be able to do that for the long term, because that's the important thing, to maintain the support for the long term.
A few years ago, you shared with me a story where former Ambassador Yeliseyev asked you, sometimes he called you and he asked, Amanda, what did you do for Ukraine today? And you sometimes woke up with such thoughts.
I think a lot of people probably wake up with that now. But I mean, back in those days, I mean, this was during the first phase of the war, when he was like, I mean, we all know Ambassador Yelisiev at that time. He was a very, you know, strong voice, a very sharp tongue as well. So he was really pushed this, you know, when you get up, the first thing you need to think is, what can I do for Ukraine today? And I think that still resonates with me, to be honest. I mean, there's not a day goes by when I don't wake up and think about Ukraine. And I think that's probably the same for many analysts that work on the region, because Ukraine is a key part of my portfolio. I mean, I think about Ukraine every single day. You know, what more can we do? What new publications, what events can be organized? How can we better help Ukraine to win this war, get a victory, and to move on to a better future as part of the European Union?
Is there anything you want to say for Ukrainians or for our audience, maybe Europeans who will be watching this podcast? Anything in particular?
I mean, maybe just to reiterate again that it's important that we continue support Ukraine till the end of this, you know, brutal war, that we stand on the right side of history, that we don't forget the atrocities that Russia has carried out against the Ukrainian people. And to European leaders, they need to keep up the momentum, including, you know, continuing to explain to the populations, you know, why it's important to keep supporting Ukraine, even though it's been difficult, and it will continue to be difficult in the future. That it's not just about Ukraine. This is a fight for the entire of European continent, for sovereignty and independence of states, and for our own security and stability against a major aggressor.
Amanda, thank you very much for a very insightful interview, discussion. I hope we can talk in half a year again about the victory already, celebrate victory together. It has been Unlock Ukraine with Amanda Paul, the expert of European Policy Center. Don't forget to subscribe to have more insightful interviews and podcasts.